Hi, do you remember last month's Messy Church story? It was all about Abraham. And do you remember when he went out of his tent one night and looked up at the stars? God said, try and count them. And then God promised one day he'd have more descendants than there were stars in the sky. Jacob was a grandson of Abraham. And he sat alone in the early hours of the morning outside of his tent, terrified. He hadn't slept, not a bit. He'd been praying and arguing with God, and he was worried and frightened because he was about to meet his brother. You might think, well, that's no big deal. I meet my brother or sister every day, usually coming out of the bathroom. But Jacob's brother was on his way to meet him, bringing with him 400 armed soldiers. And this is what had been bothering Jacob all night that kept him up. In fact, it had been bothering Jacob for a lot longer than that. Years, in fact. He'd been terrified of this moment where he had to meet his brother, whom he'd cheated twice. I'm not talking about a little game of snakes and ladders here, but we're talking blessing and birthright. You're probably thinking, what's that? Well, blessing and birthright was very important years ago when this story happened. It's about 3,500 years ago, in fact. It's about people, and people have always been the same. People have arguments. You probably have arguments. I have arguments. But blessings and birthrights, that's pretty old. And it was more important to people back then than it is now. A blessing is what your dad gave you, and it was important. It was like a promise that God made happen. So if you were blessed to be a great person, that would happen. And a birthright was like an inheritance. So when your mum and dad died, you got what they had. That was the rules. Well, that's what Jacob had cheated Esau out of. His blessing and his birthright, well, stolen really. And this had happened about 20 years ago. And Esau was so angry then that he threatened to kill Jacob, and probably would have done if Jacob hadn't run away, a long, long way. And he'd stayed away from Esau for 20 years. Sometimes forgetting what he'd done, sometimes worrying about it. Often he found himself praying about it, wishing that he'd been different and that things were different. Every time he prayed, God changed him little by little. Changed him from that cheating brother into, well, somebody different. Over the years, God had made Jacob into a rich and powerful man. And many other families had joined Jacob, and he'd become very important. He was the head of a kind of a travelling town. Because, do you remember, as in Abraham's day, they lived in tents and moved around. They didn't own buildings. But Jacob owned thousands of sheep, of goats, and hundreds of cows. And people asked for his advice all the time. He was a very important person. But the day before, one of his servants had come to him and told him that Esau was on his way with a small army. Esau had also grown rich and powerful. Esau's soldiers, about 400 of them, had got spears and swords and knives. They were strong. Jacob had a few sheep. And you know that sheep aren't much good in a fight. They just say, meh, and run away. So Jacob had to make a plan. He sat and he planned and he schemed. First, he sent away half of his walking town in one direction. The other half he kept with him, which were his own personal family and everything that he owned. Wow, he thought. If Esau catches one half of the town, the others will live. So he sent ahead of him lots of sheep as gifts for Esau, hoping that would make his brother happy. Then he sent his family across the stream to wait for him. He was left alone in the darkness. It was dark, really dark, on his own. Not the kind of darkness that we have in our towns and villages. But when you're in the middle of a desert, on your own, that is dark. So Jacob sat alone and was terrified, waiting to meet his brother and his 400 armed men. Well, the next day it was time to meet his brother. Jacob was full of fear as he walked towards Esau. He saw Esau in the distance and he bowed down to the ground 7 times, which is a sign that he was totally and completely giving in. Esau cried out. Jacob could hear it. He could hear his cry. It sounded like a cry of war to his tired ears. And his tired eyes, as he looked, all he could see was Esau charging towards him, his face all twisted and what looked like angry tears coming down his face. And Esau's men was charging behind him. "This is it," said Jacob. "This is it. This is where I die." He buried his face in the ground and closed his eyes. He heard and felt the feet pounding towards him. He heard the sound of those feet stopping and standing right next to him. He heard the breathing. Any moment now it would be over. He flinched as he felt a touch on his shoulder. Jacob opened his eyes a little bit and he saw a pair of legs. It was his brother. He was so strong he picked Jacob up with one hand. "Look at me, Jacob," said Esau. Esau opened his eyes slowly, ready to see the fury in his brother's face. But instead he looked into the eyes of a different man. It was still Esau, still the brother he had cheated all those years ago, but somehow he'd changed. Esau smiled and tears of joy came down his face. "Brother!" he shouted and flung his arms around him. Both of them cried, Esau with joy and Jacob with, relief and joy. Jacob said over and over again, I'm sorry, until Esau laid a finger on his lips to stop him. Then Esau said, "What were you thinking about sending me all these gifts?" "Wow, God has been good to me," said Jacob, "and I just thought, you know." "Hey," said Esau, "God has been good to me too." And Esau forgave Jacob. And both brothers lived in peace, away from each other. But after all, they were brothers, and they never fought each other. What do you think had changed them both? I think God had changed them both as they thought about things and grew older. And Esau knew that he needed to forgive Jacob, and Jacob was sorry for how he'd behaved. Perhaps we need to say sorry to people that we have hurt and upset. Perhaps we need to forgive those that have hurt us. Maybe we need to make peace with other people in our families or our friends. The story of Jacob and Esau teaches us that it's never too late, that we can forgive and we can make friends with people and our family. I hope you've enjoyed the story and I hope you enjoy the rest of Messy Church. Bye.